Hello, my name is Mia Wood. I am a professor of philosophy and a writer at Labroots. Welcome to Labroots' The Life of Her Mind, an interview series dedicated to learning how women think about their research, their field, and their future. Let's get started. In our inaugural conversation, we are speaking with Alice Dreger, Ph.D. Dr. Dreger is an historian and philosopher of science, a journalist, and an activist. One of those rare thinkers who draws her readers into complex and controversial topics as if they're just hanging out, jawing over a couple of drinks. Dreger's work makes people question long-held scientific doctrine. In doing so, she forces them to consider that these beliefs may just be rooted in political or personal bias. Trained in the history and philosophy of science, Dr. Dreger is the author of 4 books, editor of 5, many articles, and even many more talks. Her work reveals a fascinating combination of serious scholar, old school muckraker, and prodigious instigator, a modern day Socrates. Indeed, Dreger is unafraid to ask how and why people believe what they do. She is also very funny.
That's very kind of you.
It's true. So how does Alice Dreger's mind work? Well, let's ask her. Hello, Alice, and welcome.
Thanks, Mia.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you making time to chat. So let's get started. In your third book, Galileo's Middle Finger, you mentioned that you came to your scholarly area of expertise a bit by accident. Your dissertation advisor suggested the topic. How did that happen? And maybe more importantly, what got you excited enough about it to stick with it through the process?
Sure. So when I went to graduate school, I was already interested in issues of gender and issues of science. And the gender interest came out of feminism, which I had learned chiefly from my mother, who had a very sort of second wave feminist approach to the world of sort of recognizing the ways in which women were subject to sexism that held them back. And my interest in science had also been longstanding and also supported by my parents. But I had actually gone to undergraduate at Georgetown University for a year and was double majoring in science and English, biology and English, and was very burned out. I was a high achieving student and I was really burned out. I was having an affair with a teacher from my high school who had started using me for sex years before, and I was just burned out. So I quit school and got away from that guy and became a mortgage broker on Long Island for 5 years. And during that period, I ended up finishing my degree at the State University of New York down the street, which was Old Westbury, while still doing mortgage brokering all day long. And my therapist that I started seeing told me at one point, "You're cured, get out of New York." So I applied to Indiana University because my dissertation director, my undergraduate advisor had gotten his PhD there and said, "Well, you're interested in both gender and science and philosophy and history, so this seems like a good program for you." So my dissertation director, I actually had 2, but the one who suggested the topic to me was Fred Churchill, who is a historian of embryology. And Fred knew that I was interested in gender and science. And so he said to me, "Well, why don't you look at the history of hermaphroditism?" Because nobody had looked at that. And since he was a historian of embryology, I thought, okay, I'll look at embryology. Thought I would look at Darwin's barnacles because those were hermaphroditic. What did Darwin think about that? But Fred kept saying, "You should look at medicine." And I was like, why? It doesn't happen in humans past the embryonic stage. So then I took another class with Jean Peterson in the history department in Victorian medicine, and I was interested in still hermaphroditism. And Jean said, "You should really look at medicine." And I was like, why? So finally, I opened the great catalogs of 19th century medicine, the index catalog of the Library of the Surgeon General of the United States, which is the precursor to what people now know as PubMed or Medline. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human case studies. And I was like, okay, how could it possibly be that at age, whatever I was, 24, 25, I've never heard of this? That doesn't make any sense to me. So I was convinced it had been suppressed, and anything that is suppressed is very interesting. So why had all this knowledge of human what we now call intersex conditions been suppressed? So I decided to tackle this for my dissertation, and it was easy to be excited about it because it was a topic that had in fact been suppressed in the public knowledge. And yet there was this entire secret medical literature about it. So I started pulling all of the cases that I could in the 19th century in France and Britain for reasons we could talk about if you want. But basically, there were two places I felt like going for my dissertation research. So, and also I could read French and I could read English. And so that worked. But also France and England were both interesting places in terms of the development of science and medicine at that time. So I ended up finding a sort of natural starting point, which was 1848 for reasons we can talk about if you want, to 1914. And pulled about a little over 300 cases and created large databases, which most historians weren't doing at that time and still are not doing. I had developed a database for my mortgage brokering work that allowed me to figure out how to track refinances more efficiently in our office. We used a program called DB3, Database 3. So I used that same program to create databases about all the cases I was reading about. And I tracked where were they showing up? Who were they? Which doctors were seeing them? What did the doctors think? What did they say about the breasts or the clitoris or the penis or whatever it was? I just tracked it all. And I had these huge notebooks on dot matrix, because back then all the printers were dot matrix paper that took up, half of my living room. And I was just super excited about it because it was an incredibly interesting topic. So I had no trouble staying attuned to it. And got my dissertation done in about 2 years, which was considered a very fast period of time to get a history dissertation done. But I mean, I type fast and I research hard. And so it was not too difficult for me to do.
I didn't know about so in some of the talks that you've given that I've seen, on YouTube, you've said, you've made comments about how committed researchers should be to the data, but it didn't occur to me. I don't know if I just didn't know, or you haven't said that you adapted a database that you developed while you were a mortgage broker. That's amazing. Can you say more? How did that occur to you?
Well, I was doing a degree in history and philosophy of science. And so, of course, we were studying philosophy of science. And so we were talking a lot about data and data analysis and letting the data talk to you instead of you talking to the data. So it seemed obvious to me that one thing that I could do was to try to quantify to some degree what I was looking at. Part of what I was interested in is the question of whether or not the number of reports was going up over time, which it was, and where was it going up over time, and what kinds of things were doctors interested in? Because the sex of the body is all over the body, right? It's on the feet. The feet are sexed to some degree, the hips, the breasts. So what were they interested in terms of the location of their fascination? And so it seemed to me kind of an obvious thing to do. Although I have to say that my dissertation committee was like, "What the hell are you doing?" Because they had not experienced, although I had two dissertation directors, because one was Fred Churchill in history of science and the other one was Anne Carmichael in the history of medicine. And it was important because I was bridging those two to have two dissertation directors. And I was very fortunate to have two excellent directors. Anne ended up using computer software to map her interest was in the plague during the Middle Ages. And so she used or maybe it was the Renaissance. I apologize. I can't quite remember which period she was studying, but she was using mapping databases to try to figure out how the plague had broken out and what happened, who died, where did they die. So Anne was kind of coming at that out of epidemiology. And I sort of had the same sense of like, well, we could take a sort of, scientific approach to this to some degree and try to figure it out. So I see history as a social science. And that's an example of using sort of a more scientific, more quantitative kind of approach to textual analysis.
And the I don't know if I should call it the overlay or the underpinning, but the philosophical disposition, right? That you use in that project and in your subsequent projects seems clear, which is, okay, what am I bringing to the table to interpret the data? What's the scope of knowledge? What sorts of questions should I ask so that I can get the right answers? Do you, when your advisors asked, what the heck, or your committee asked what the heck was going on, how did you approach answering that? Did you basically say, okay, well, I'm taking this disposition to the project where I'm asking these sorts of questions, and this is what I'm hoping to find, or I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but this is what I did find?
Yeah, they weren't, just be clear, they weren't upset with what I was doing. They were just baffled. And so I showed them the notebooks. I showed them these binders that I had, in which basically I had sorted by different, so these were spreadsheets, right, to some degree. And I was sorting according to different possibilities. So I could, for example, sort out what had been said about breasts in France versus Britain and be able to understand the difference in how they were understanding breast tissue as a sexed tissue. And so I showed them all of this stuff. And I showed them, for example, how I could track certain individuals who were patients through time in the medical literature, because I had plugged in the information the doctor had given us about where were they born, what was their profession, what were their initials, so that even though they weren't named in the medical literature, I could have a high degree of confidence that I was actually tracking the same person. And that would be really interesting, because tracking the same person meant getting different doctors' viewpoints of that person. So when I showed them what I was doing, they were like, oh yeah, this makes total sense. And you're going to find far more things than if you just did a hand picking analysis and said, I'm just going to pull a few of these and pick the most interesting ones and talk about the most interesting ones. I mean, I think part of what bothered me was the habit at that time among postmodern philosophers and literary critics to cherry pick texts. And I was somebody who really felt like if we were going to understand history, we really couldn't cherry pick the texts. We really had to know what was the range out there, and then what was really going on in terms of the thinking. So I was not interested in trying to take a single text and do a very intense deconstructive analysis on a single text. I was really interested in the question of how is the profession shifting with regard to having to face the reality of sex blurring. And this was a time where, in the late 19th century, where women were challenging sex borders, where people we would now call gay and lesbian were challenging sex borders and saying that they should not be subject to restrictions on their lives. And so it was a time when people were pressing the boundaries that had existed for a long time culturally. And doctors tended to be conservative men. And so they were not interested in having those borders pushed. So I was really fascinated with the question of how did they manage their own political needs in the face of this biological reality.
So so I know the history is long. Do you think that for the average, either, clinician or researcher, that history is sort of too big to wrap their arms around, to make sense in the way that you did with this topic? Or is it just that there's not so much interest in doing that by and large, or it's not part of medical school training?
Well, I mean, if you're interested in specific stuff that I found, I wrote what I think is a very readable book called Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex, which is my dissertation basically cleaned up and made into a book. And that book very specifically is designed for an intelligent general readership. And actually, the book has done incredibly well. I mean, I still get royalties over it for 20 years later, 25 years later, I'm still getting some royalties, not huge amounts, but, enough to buy me some dinners every year. So I like to think that's because the book is indeed readable. And basically what I showed in the book was that what physicians and scientists did at this point when they were faced with this very uncomfortable biological reality that sex was very, very complicated, was they came up with a whole bunch of techniques to organize them theoretically so that you could pretend that there was no threat to the social order. And they used all sorts of categorization systems. And then later they used surgeries to try to make sure that everybody fit into a simple male or female category socially, so that there would not be a social disruption, because they recognized the potential for social disruption of the biological reality.
In fact, your TED Talk was my introduction to your work. I was working in bioethics is not my area, but it was, hey, do this course. I was like, okay, try. And so we were talking about identity issues, and that talk is just fascinating. That talk grew out of the work that you did for your dissertation that subsequently became the book. Is that?
It did, although then, after, so when I started publishing my work, I was publishing it in journal articles, as is typical. And the first piece I published was in a journal called Victorian Studies. And I forget what it was called. But what happened was the internet was relatively new and email was relatively new, but people who had themselves been born with the conditions I was writing about had started the intersex rights movement. And they found me and started writing to me on email. And that was kind of surprising to me because I hadn't really thought about the fact that, of course, there are people with the same conditions. I just thought of myself as doing dead people. I don't do living people. So it didn't occur to me that living people with the same conditions would write and contact me and ask me to join the movement. But that did happen, and I did end up joining the intersex rights movement. So the TED Talk that you saw is as much informed by many years of working in the intersex rights movement. And ultimately, I became one of the leaders of the intersex rights movement internationally and agitated for many years for change in medical practice and social treatment of people born with intersex conditions.
When did you, and how did you make the decision to so you were in a tenured position at Michigan State, or up for tenure, forgive me, I can't remember which it was, but you left that position, which a lot of researchers would think is either incredibly brave or incredibly crazy, but you decided to leave that. You went to Northwestern for a part-time position, but so that you could, presumably you could devote more time to the work in activism. How did that happen? Why did you make that choice?
Yeah, so I started the job at Michigan State. I graduated in 95. I did a year of postgraduate faculty position sabbatical replacement for John Beatty, who's a historian of biology at University of Minnesota for a year. And then I got a tenure track position at Michigan State. And I started the job at Michigan State in 96. And I got early tenure. I think in my 5th year, I was awarded tenure. And after that, I got pregnant, or maybe before that, I can't remember. But anyway, I had a son, and he was born in the year 2000. And what ended up happening was that by that point, my advocacy work in the intersex movement was going full throttle. I was president of the board of the Intersex Society of North America, giving lots of talks, doing lots of activism work. I was also maintaining a traditional academic career. So I was researching academic articles, publishing them, giving academic talks, also teaching classes, also doing community service work, also doing journal editorship kind of work at the lower level and all of that stuff. And so I had both of those things going, and I had a child, and I need a lot of sleep. And my son did not really start sleeping through the night until he was about 2.5.
Oh boy.
And so it was extremely difficult for me to maintain that life. And I had actually always wanted to be a writer primarily, not to be a historian or an activist or anything like that. I had always been interested in writing, and my 4th grade teacher had told me that wasn't a real job. And so I'd have to find some other job. So I had always spent my life sort of in this approach avoidance attitude towards writing as a profession. But obviously I really love writing. I mean, my books are all written as though they're written by a person who wants to be a writer. And it turns out, I did become a writer. So when I was facing the problem of lack of sleep and overwhelming activist career, plus an overwhelming academic career, I made a list of what I enjoyed and what I didn't enjoy. And what I really enjoyed, which surprised me, was being with my son. I was shocked at how much I enjoyed being a mother. I did not expect that of myself. I mean, I intentionally had a child with a man I intentionally chose for being the father of that child, but I was still very surprised at how much my brain reoriented towards wanting to be with my kid. And having him go to daycare for long periods was upsetting to me because I felt like I was being cheated out of an opportunity to experience that relationship with him and watching him grow. Child development is incredibly interesting, especially when it's your own kid. And once he started talking, he was very, very interesting to me. And I found myself less inclined to take care of other people's kids. I had been a very intense teacher. I won my department's teaching award, which was awarded by the students every year, 7 years in a row, because I was a very devoted, very active teacher. But that was because I was giving all that maternal energy to them. And when I had my own kid, my maternal sense really did shift. Mm-hmm. And so I made the list of what I enjoyed and what I didn't enjoy. My son was on there and writing was right up there, but I was having less and less time to do writing. And what I didn't enjoy was my job. I didn't enjoy the committee work. I did enjoy teaching, but I hated grading, hated it, hated teaching writing to freshmen. Even though I was good at it, I hated doing it because I was a professional writer who did not want to keep teaching. This is like if you had somebody who's a professional ice skater having to teach somebody to just put on their skates every day. It's exhausting to do that. So I said to my spouse, I think I want to give up tenure and become an independent and do writing and do the activism, but mostly get more sleep and be with the kid and have a more sane life. And he said, well, why don't you think about it a little longer? Because that's a really big decision. And he's very conventional. This is how we've operated. He's very conventional. I'm very unconventional. So we feed off of each other that way. I mentioned it to my mother-in-law, who thought it was a great idea. Quit your job. Mentioned it to my mother, who said, absolutely, do it. You'll only get one chance to experience, you may have another kid, but you're only going to have a chance once or twice to experience motherhood. And she said, it's worth it. Do it. And also having more time for writing was important. So I tried talking Michigan State into a part-time job. And I tried again and again, and they wouldn't take me seriously. And I said, so finally I submitted a letter of resignation, which simply said, this has been great. Thank you. I'm leaving. And they said, wait. No, we'll help you figure this out. And I was like, look, I asked you for like a year to help me figure this out, and you gave me no assistance whatsoever. So goodbye. So I left, and they were shocked. They were genuinely shocked. They never really thought I would leave. And then some friends of mine at Northwestern called me up and were like, we're putting together a program. And there was the program in medical humanities and bioethics. We're putting together a master's program, and we need somebody to teach the history of science, the history of medicine course. So I actually, at first, they didn't have the master's program. At first, they just asked me would I like to teach a seminar for them in their program. And I enjoyed that very much. Teaching medical students was really fun. And then I became the teacher of the history of medicine class in the master's program. And most people from the outside thought I had a full professorship because I was promoted to full professor fairly quickly at Northwestern, but it was always a part-time adjunct position. And most people just didn't know that. I didn't broadcast that. It didn't pay very well. They refused to give me retirement. I had to fight like hell. I think I got 1 year of retirement out of them. It was very frustrating in terms of the treatment by the top administration, but the middle administration treated me very well. And my department was full of lovely people who I loved working with, and I loved working with the medical students. So I commuted to Chicago, 220 miles each way. And I taught in the winter quarter, which was January to March, which is not the best time to be going around Lake Michigan, I have to say. But for 10 years, I did that. And my son and I and my husband built a schedule around that so that I could go every week for 10 weeks in a row. And otherwise, I did most of the stuff remotely, which, nowadays we all know how to do that. But I learned how to do that very early. And if there was a huge snow, I taught my class remotely. They were in the seminar room and they stuck me at the end of the table, and we had a remote conversation. So that was before Zoom. It was just me at the end of the table. And I forget what software we used back then to do that. But I did that for 10 years. And then my dean censored some work that I published that I had not written, but I had edited and published in a journal that our department put out. And I tried to change the censorship for over a year and got nowhere. So a colleague of mine, Christy Kirshner, and I both quit the department over the censorship. And I've not been in an academic position since, except that I do give a lot of academic talks, and I occasionally have a week on somebody's campus because they'll invite me to be a presidential this or that. And I go for a week and get to enjoy being back on a campus for a week.
Do you mind my asking about sort of in connection with the experiences that you had with administration? You detail, for example, the journal Atrium, the experience with the university kind of giving over the domain of the journal to the hospital that was taking over the medical center, and that they kind of had a brand that they wanted to promote. And the article that you had, one of the articles that you had solicited had been read by the dean, I believe, and rubbed that person the wrong way. no pun intended. And so that's what set off that, what eventually led you to resign. But can you say, if I've got my facts right, can you say a little bit about, and I know it's not directly on the questions that I was thinking about asking, but the connection between the importance of the concept of academic freedom, which I think a lot of people, including some academics, seem to misunderstand, right? Academic freedom and doing really good scholarly work that benefits, a well-informed citizenry.
Yeah, so it wasn't that the hospital bought the domain, but the hospital and the medical school came to a kind of agreement, and it was a secret agreement because Northwestern is a private medical school and Northwestern Hospital is a private hospital, so we couldn't see the agreements. But basically, I was told that the dean's concern was over the branding agreement between the hospital and the medical school. And the article that was published was an article called Head Nurses, which was by Bill Peace, who is a cultural anthropologist and disability studies scholar. And Bill was writing about his own experience at the age of 18 of becoming spinal cord disabled, and a nurse who gave him oral sex to reassure him that his sex life would continue on. And they were friends. They had known each other for months. And she was doing it out of a place of compassion while he was in a long-term rehabilitation facility. And he was not writing to suggest that this is what should happen today. He was writing to talk about what he called the Wild West days of rehabilitation medicine, which to me as a historian of medicine and a historian of sexuality was really interesting because it was a really interesting period in the 1970s. The 1970s was a period of experimentation with drugs, experimentation with sex. And that stuff leaked into the rehabilitation hospitals. People were doing drugs and having sex. And so it was a particularly interesting period as a historian of medicine. So I thought it was a really well-written piece and super interesting. And Bill did raise the question of do we take care of the sexual needs of people with disability today? And he didn't mean literally, do we give them sexual opportunities, but rather do we pay attention to the fact that they want to have sex in the future? And so I thought his piece was excellent, as did my colleagues. And I think the only thing that one of them suggested was that the title should be in quotation mark because the title was Head Nurse, which was a joke.
Good one.
But there were other, frankly, very intense pieces in that particular issue. Every issue of the journal Atrium was very intense on purpose. This was a very hard-hitting medical humanities journal that made us all uncomfortable all the time. And this particular issue was the one I got to edit. The theme that the group came up with was bad girls. And so there were several pieces in there on abortion that I thought were actually the ones that were going to get us in trouble. I thought the piece that was written by, sorry, I'm forgetting her name, but it was a person who does women's studies, and she's also an OBGYN, and she was writing about doing abortions as women's work. And she was talking about the fact that she found that the light boxes from Bed Bath & Beyond are actually the most useful ones for taking out the products of conception and looking at it to make sure that she had gotten everything out of the uterus. And, that made me uncomfortable. That had me squirming. The idea of using stuff from Bed Bath & Beyond to do abortions had me squirming. So I thought that was, if I got in trouble for anything, it was going to be that one, but it wasn't that one. Apparently a couple of Catholic nurses complained about the piece by Bill Peace. I'm sure they also were upset about the pieces about transgender life and about women's sports and about abortion and everything else. But, I was told, shut up, don't talk about it. The dean ordered Dean Eric Nielsen, who's still the dean of Northwestern's medical school, ordered that Bill's piece be taken down offline. He couldn't withdraw the paper copies that had already been sent out, but this was censorship. This was not, people say, well, it's not really censorship because he didn't take it back, but he did. He literally censored the piece and withdrew it. And to the credit of the people in my department, they basically took down all of Atrium at that point because they said, you're not going to take down one thing and not all of it. But we were kind of told, shut up, let's try to work this out. And I did. I kept my mouth shut for over a year in terms of not challenging it. And finally, I had Galley's Middle Finger was coming out, and it's a book about academic freedom. It's a book that encourages people to do controversial work, to do cutting edge stuff and go where they need to go in terms of the questions and the answers. And I went to the deans. I made an appointment with them and I said, here are the blurbs about the book, these important people blurbing about the importance of academic freedom. I cannot be a hypocrite. I can't put up with your censorship of this work. So it's me or you, basically, you got to change or I got to leave. And they said, thank you for your input. And then I tried the provost, Dan Linzer at the time of Northwestern, and basically said the same thing, like, Dan, like, you're gonna fix this or not? And he didn't. So Christy Kirshner, my colleague, quit, and I quit, both over the censorship. And we went very public with it because we thought people should know what had happened. That basically, and this was particularly ironic because Bill Peace's article was about how the fact that people with disabilities have their sex lives censored. And that's exactly what happened with this article, was his sex life was censored. So it was outrageous, and we made a big deal of it. And I could have gone and looked for other academic jobs at that point, but I was so bitter from that experience. And I also didn't want people thinking I'd done it as a publicity stunt or an attempt to get to a different university. So I just told people, that I needed to do something else for a while. And I did do that. And I've not gone back, in part because of having watched things. My spouse is now the dean of Michigan State's medical school. And when he was being appointed, he asked me if I wanted to pursue a spousal hire back at Michigan State. Michigan State is a fine university, but honestly, the way that things are happening in academia today, I think I would last about a week.
This problem that you've talked about concentrated in higher education and all the avenues of research within higher education strikes me as sort of a microcosm for so much that's going on, in the world, which makes me think that there's, in addition to the point that you've made about resiliency, or maybe part and parcel of that is just and a lack of skill associated with listening, assessing problems, assessing evidence, assessing what counts as evidence and what the appropriate evidence is, and so forth. That's everywhere. But it seems particularly concerning in the research arms of higher education when so much, of discovery and innovation, let's say, particularly within the physical sciences, right, is happening there. So I know you've had some experiences with colleagues in the sciences kind of running into problems with effectively strawman arguments against their work, right? Complete distortions of their work, and then they get sort of pushed aside, marginalized, or otherwise just pushed off the page. Do you see that? So I guess my question is, what sorts of tools do you think the researcher, whether they're a scientist, a physical scientist, or otherwise, what tools does the researcher need in order to follow the evidence?
Oops, you froze. Could you say the question again? Sorry.
What sorts of tools do you think that any researcher needs in order to follow the evidence where it leads, in order to have the open mind to consider that they might be wrong, for example?
Well, it's very hard. I mean, we become emotionally invested in the things that we study, and it's inevitable that we become emotionally invested in them because that's what keeps us going, right? It's the passion for the work. So, all of the things that we've set up in modern science tends to help, things like peer review, things like repeatability expectations. But of course, some of that fails. We've had the great repeatability crisis in psychology, for example, where people go out and they do a single study and it's very exciting and everybody says, oh, that's very interesting, and nobody repeats it and finds out it doesn't hold. Peer review is obviously quite challenging in the sense that it's always politicized, inevitably, even though we try not to make it that way. So, I think one of the things that has to happen is there have to be sort of checks and balances on the system. Just one example would be Retraction Watch, which I'm a huge fan of and a donor to, is a news organization that basically tracks retractions within the scientific literature and uses that as a window into looking at misconduct, but also looking at whether or not the self-correcting systems of science are really working. So they recently talked about a guy who retracted his own papers because he redid an analysis and realized he got some numbers totally wrong, and sort of lauded him as a hero. And I don't disagree. Although he said, I'm just doing what we should all do, right? Which is retract our work when we discover that there's an error. But it's weird how rarely that happens, that people admit errors in their work. So, I think we have to really acknowledge that if we're doing work that's really good, that sometimes it's going to involve an ego bruising. And when I go through that, when I have to correct something I've done, I actually get a weird little thrill from it, because I think, oh, I'm part of a system that's correcting. And it's and I wish we could get more people to feel that way, that when, the first feeling in my gut is, oh man, I screwed up. And, it feels sad and it makes me like, ugh. And then I have to do the work and see, did I screw it up? How did I screw it up? And then if I did, and I have to do a correction of it, then I do get this sort of weird little high where I'm like, well, you know what, I'm human and I should have the humility to do corrections, and that's a good thing. So it feels kind of good, but I don't think we convey that enough. I really do wish that every class in colleges and universities today would deal with questions of reason and evidence. And it troubles me that a lot of them don't engage that they're doing, in the case of the humanities, sometimes a lot of incredibly sloppy teaching, which is just about low-level sort of political text analysis. And on the sciences side, just conveyance of facts, which is really not teaching you how to think. So I wish every college and university class today would engage, especially undergraduates, but also graduate students, in questions of reason and evidence all the time. I mean, I think the way that we got to January 6th and we got to the problems we have today are not just caused by the college and university level, but there's some hope there of helping to correct things.
And at first, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. There's so much that I want to ask you, but sure. I don't want to impose too much. So, you've talked a little bit about the process that you go through when you think you may have made a mistake. Do you think that the process, I mean, so the specific details of the process would probably be different from one discipline to the next, but the sort of the process of revisiting your work is similar across your disciplines. And if I understand correct, well, I think of you as being, you're a journalist, you're a popular philosopher, or you do public philosophy, I should say. Obviously, you're an historian of medical science, and you're an historian of science. Do you see there being a process that's similar across those disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm less of a historian these days than I used to be, more of a journalist. So in 2014, I founded a newspaper for the people of East Lansing called East Lansing Info. And so I ended up doing not just journalism at the national level, which I also did because I ended up having to do journalism to help advance information about intersex and what was going on with intersex care. But also, in addition to that, I founded a local newspaper. So what I would say is that, I mean, the process is very similar in terms of we're looking for evidence. We're trying not to impose our own point of view. That said, anytime you're asking a question, you're narrowing the data that you're looking for. So there's always that issue.
Brings me to some of the other issues with which you've been involved. So, for example, you were brought back to the intersex issue when, and forgive me, maybe you'll tell the story, but it was brought to your attention that a researcher, a clinician and researcher, was using dexamethasone, I guess purportedly to try to prevent intersex babies. And it seems to me, and unless I missed the way the story went, that that person's work being, corrected was not, I don't know if it went under the radar, if it didn't go under the radar, if it's not relevant to the point I was making about people being open to receiving corrections, but how did that happen? And what's the status now?
Yeah, so this is the story that takes up the last third of Galileo's middle finger, because the first two-thirds of Galileo's middle finger are largely about activists attacking scientists and my sort of dismay over that. And a lot of people think that's all the book is about how terrible it is that activists attack scientists. But the last third of the book reminds people why activists are very important in terms of correcting the scientific system that will sometimes not correct itself. And it talks about my being pulled back into intersex advocacy. I think it was 2009 or 2010, I got calls from friends of mine. I had at that point retired from intersex activist work. And they let me know that a researcher that I knew very well, clinician researcher in New York City, Maria New, who's a pediatric endocrinologist and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, was using dexamethasone prenatally. Dexamethasone is a steroid a lot of us have heard about because of COVID. It's a generic steroid that calms down inflammation as well as having other effects. And she was using it in very early pregnancy, starting it as soon as pregnancy was acknowledged, to try to prevent the development of intersex characteristics in women who were at risk of having a child with one particular condition, which is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. In some cases of CAH, female fetuses can be virilized. So they can be born with genitals that are in between male and female, or even genitals that go all the way to the male side of the spectrum, even though they're genetic females and have a uterus, and typically a uterus and ovaries inside. So the problem with using this was not the attempt to prevent intersex, but the way that she was talking about it, which was she was claiming it had been found safe for mother and child when she was selling it to the patients, but then turning around and telling the NIH she needed money to study these people retroactively to see whether or not it was safe or effective. So these people didn't know they were in an experiment. And this was a drug being used with the intention of crossing the placental barrier, with the intention of altering fetal development. And 7 out of 8 of the fetuses affected with the treatment would not even be the type that they meant to target. The reason being only half of the fetuses would be female, half would be male. And CAH is autosomal recessive, and you don't need to know what that means to know only 1 in 4 of the offspring of the parents at risk would end up having this disease. And it is a disease. It's an endocrine disease. The intersex is a side effect that develops because of the disease. So only 1 in 8 of the fetuses would even benefit, in theory, according to what she thought of as benefit from this intervention. So 7 out of 8 of the fetuses were being blasted with this with no possibility of benefit. And the research she had done coming out of it was terrible. I mean, it was just really shoddy and unable to conclude anything, basically. And there were physicians who were very upset about what she was doing because they felt like this was a very high risk maneuver. And there was research at that point coming out of Sweden showing that children had been harmed by this. And the Swedish group was taking a lot of flack from her group and her defenders. And so I got involved in that, thinking we would just ask the federal government to investigate, because it was an NIH-funded project. Her retrospective studies were NIH funded, and she had some small prospective studies to study particular things like genetic screening. And I thought that the FDA would also get involved because this was an off-label use of the drug. But more importantly, she was advertising the drug as safe and effective when this was an off-label use. The FDA had not said you could say this was safe or effective. So then it's a very long story, but she made the claim that the FDA had said it was safe and effective, which was this outrageous lie, that she could not prove. She had a letter which vaguely said one thing from a doctor from years ago, but absolutely not the case that this is FDA approved by any means, no less the FDA approving advertising it as safe and effective. I thought this was so completely outrageous that the government would absolutely act. And instead, I was set up, as I explain in the book. The people who managed to get the investigation assigned to them were people who were allies of hers. And when they came out with their report basically saying that I was wrong, and at the same time, one of their side groups published a paper calling me deeply unethical for having brought all this forward, they published both on the same day. And I didn't realize they were associated. So I thought I had been proved unethical and wrong. And I nearly killed myself. And that's in the book, although it's alluded to sort of vaguely about a break in my brain. And it took a long time to recover from that. And the recovery largely involved my spouse and my best friend, Ellen Fader, who was one of the people who had worked on the petitions to the government with me, telling me over and over again, nothing we found was wrong. Their conclusion is wrong. You're not wrong. So I spent the next 2 years researching everything I could about this, and demanded all the grant reports and everything out of the through the Freedom of Information Act, which the FDA and the Office for Human Research Protections refused to give to me. It didn't even acknowledge my requests, simply ignored me. So I sued them, and the suit led to them having to release the material to me. And I got the material, and I put together the truth of what happened, which was I was right, that we were right. And we were not only right, we were horrifyingly right, that Cornell knew about what was going on and didn't do anything about it, basically. And in fact, Cornell had been hit with a $4 million fine at one point because an internal whistleblower had blown the whistle. And it turned out that whistleblowing was partly about what I had found. So it was a huge, very scary situation, both for the women and the children who were subjected to these lies and made to go through these treatments, but also for me personally, because they really came after me. The particular group of people didn't want me saying that what had happened was a huge ethical travesty. And as it turns out, when you ask what's happening with dexamethasone today, I can't figure it out. It's very unclear to me. She seems to have been retired finally, which is not surprising because she'd be 90 years old now, or something like, close to 90 or over 90 years old. And it does not appear that people are openly advertising this use. The endocrine groups came out with strong cautions against using it in any form other than a fully vetted, fully consented experimental system where women absolutely knew the truth about what they were signing up for, which I don't think a lot of women, frankly, would sign up for it if they knew the truth. Mm-hmm. But that said, we've had COVID now, and a very common treatment for COVID is dexamethasone. And a lot of pregnant women have been given dexamethasone. And I keep saying to my spouse, is anybody tracking what's happening to the fetuses being exposed to dexamethasone? Because I would love to know what the heck's happening there. The other thing that's happened is I reported in the Atlantic, I found out by accident that some IVF doctors have been giving dexamethasone to women claiming it prevents miscarriage, which is completely a lie. There's no evidence whatsoever that dexamethasone prevents miscarriage, but it's been given out like candy, I think on the basis of Maria New's claims that it's been found safe and effective, because basically she went out and made this claim in the literature over and over again until people simply believe it. If you make a claim over and over again and you just cite yourself, people assume you're telling the truth. And it's a case, it killed me because I couldn't find reporters willing to write about it because it was a complex case. And most reporters today, because of the way the internet has destroyed the investigative journalism establishment, they don't have time to deal with it. And so it's been very, very hard to get it into newspapers. And that's part of why I became a journalist, was so that I could start reporting what I was finding about dexamethasone and start alerting people to it. Because it is so upsetting.
Will you, so it sounds to me, tell me if I'm wrong, like you've got the material for your next book. They actually, given what you've just said about the prevalence of dexamethasone during COVID and tracking and so forth, what those findings might be, and retroactively, what we should be thinking about the original conflict, right, between saying that the drug was safe off-label, but working the study that's determining safety, right? All of that seems like it would make for a really fascinating read.
Yeah, I really think that the question of what's happening with dexamethasone in the population treated with COVID is going to have to be something epidemiologists study, because that's really an epidemiological question. And I was drawing on their work when I was trying to figure out what had happened to this population. No, I think, well, the book proposal I have now that my agent's working on placing is actually about storytelling and about the importance of storytelling to human survival, which comes out of all of this work in part, not so much the prenatal dexamethasone, but the issue of the ways in which we have a totally broken now storytelling system. But I have instead thought about doing a book about having done local news for almost 10 years and the experience of being within journalism and the ways in which the media system looks when you're inside of it, because it really is very different than most people think. People have this sort of good or evil view of the media, and it's far more complicated than that. It's very, very similar to the sciences in terms of having a theoretical devotion to facts. But the question is where the rubber meets the road. And there are some people who are, in fact, very dedicated to that process. But there are other people who, as we know, wear the costume and then just make stuff up. And that happens in all sorts of areas. So the kinds of checks and balances systems that are important in the sciences are exactly the same as those that are important in the news system. And I think that would be a very interesting book. But to be honest, I'm about to release my first murder mystery. Over the last several years, I've been writing murder mysteries to give myself psychological relief. So my first book is, I'm going to serialize it so people can read it for free and give me feedback to drive up interest in it. But it's called The Index Case, and it will be released soon. It will also be released on paper. You'll be able to buy it. I'm self-publishing it because I frankly didn't want to deal with the publishing industry on this, because I've so enjoyed writing them. I've had friends of mine editing them and giving me feedback. And I'm currently writing the fourth book in the series, but none of them have been released yet. I've been doing that privately for my own sake.
Well, count me in, because I'm a huge mystery fan. I read mysteries from everywhere in the world.
I'll send you one for sure.
Yeah. And I'll buy them when they come out. But yeah, absolutely. So, okay. So, when my last question was going to be, so what's next? Thank you for telling us. So you're placing a book now. You're getting ready to release the mystery series, and potentially now I'm going to mispronounce it. Why the word escaped me? Not
Dexamethasone.
Dexamethasone, and the book on journalism. So we'll look forward.
Hopefully, yes. And I have a podcast that's about to be released that is called Just Answer the Question, and that is highly produced. So it's not your sort of interviewing one person thing, which I enjoy, but I wanted to do something that was more writerly and more compositional. Mm-hmm. So my friend Mike Teeger is my producer, and we have people on around a central question, like what have I done is our first one. And then we have one on what's it like to play me. We interviewed the women who have played me in the oral versions of my books, so the audio books. I was curious, what's it like to play me? And we also have an episode coming up on how could you love a rat, because we've had pet rats, but we also talk about human rats and how do you love a human rat. And so that's been a lot of fun, because that's been a very different form of writing for me, taking these interviews and piecing them together and doing an overarching narration, and then Mike adds music. And that's been really, really fun for me. So that's been something sort of different. And then I have a newsletter that I just started, which is available through my website, alicedreger.com. So I'm on sabbatical from the newspaper, but when I went on sabbatical, the newspaper collapsed without me. So I'm also about to chair a task force of trying to figure out how to get the newspaper back and move that along again, because people need local news. So yeah. A lot of the projects I'm doing now are not academic projects, because I am 56 years old and I feel like I've earned the right to be a writer finally after all these years. So I'm enjoying being a writer right now. And that's been really cool.
Yes, congratulations on all of those projects.
Thank you.
Am I right to think that the podcast, obviously one can access it through the various media for that, or programs for that, but will you announce it through alicedreger.com as well?
We will, yes. We just finished shooting a promo video for it. It's not a video podcast, but we did a promo video for it, and that'll be released with the first 3 episodes quite soon. Mike and I are both kind of perfectionists. So we've been like fiddling with the first 3 episodes to make sure we think they're perfect. But we just did an interview today, for example, for the episode Why Run, which is an exploration of why physically run, but also why run for office, because both Mike and I are runners. But we're also interested in the question of why do people run for office? And we just interviewed today Jocelyn Benson, who's the Secretary of State of Michigan, who was just testifying yesterday at the Select Committee on the January 6th hearings. I'm a big fan of hers. And we also interviewed Peter Sagal for that episode from NPR's Wait, Don't Tell Me, because he's a runner, a marathoner. And so it's a really fun episode about why run for office and why physically run. And it looks at the interplay between those two kinds of runnings. And actually the interview with Jocelyn Benson was fantastic because she talked about marathoning as a metaphor in her life for the kinds of work she does to keep elections safe. So it was really, really interesting. So that's been a blast for me because I get to interview really interesting people. So I'm loving it.
Oh, I definitely want to listen to that. I'm old, so I'm slow to the podcast process, but it's such a wonderful way. It's almost like old time radio.
It is. It's really fun.
Yeah, I will make a point to listen to your podcast. What's the name again?
Just Answer the Question.
Answer the question. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much for your time and your expertise.
You're very welcome.
On behalf of Walter, my my classroom and Labroots dog, I thank you so much. And I hope that we'll be able to catch up with you again when your next book comes out.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mia.
Thank you so much.